Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Summer Hacking Update webinar by LMG Security. My name is Natalie Bray, and I'm your moderator for today. Our presenter for the Summer Hacking Update is Matt Durhan. Matt Durhan is the Director of Training and Research at LMG Security and a senior consultant with the organization. He is an instructor at the International Black Hat USA Conference, where he has taught classes on ransomware and data breaches. Matt has conducted cybersecurity seminars, tabletop exercises, and classes for thousands of attendees in all sectors, including banking, retail, healthcare, government, and more. A seasoned cybersecurity and IT professional, Matt specializes in ransomware response and research, as well as deployment of proactive cybersecurity solutions. Matt holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from the University of Montana, and his malware research has been featured on NBC Nightly News. Matt, at this time, I am passing it over to you.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. I'm always really excited to be able to give this presentation on a yearly basis because it is kind of a culmination of the research and all of the fun kind of back-end projects that we as cybersecurity professionals get to work on throughout the year leading up to what we affectionately refer to as Hacker Summer Camp. And Hacker Summer Camp, if you're not familiar with that kind of nuanced term, is the combination of conferences that take place in Las Vegas every year right around the beginning of August. This includes B-Sides, Black Hat, which we are a part of, and the DEFCON conference. And there is always a ton of cutting edge research, very interesting projects, and a lot of other just really amazing presentations that we get to attend while we are in Las Vegas for this gathering of cybersecurity minds. Now we'll start off talking about Black Hat. Black Hat is celebrating its 25th anniversary. A quarter century of hacking is how they described the event this year. This was also the first time in a few years that Black Hat has gone to a largely in-person format. Over the last couple of years, based on the COVID-19 pandemic, the conference moved into a very heavy hybrid type of setup where a vast majority of the attendees went to all the briefings and classes via Zoom or via GoToWebinar or another kind of, basically teleconferencing service. While that was a good kind of stopgap for the conference as a whole, there really is something about being in person at these events that makes them very, very valuable. And it's that interaction, those impromptu conversations, those random events that you find yourself attending, where a lot of the really nice things about the conference are really made clear. Now, Black Hat specifically went all out this time around. They had over 80 briefings scheduled for the 25th anniversary event. There were some amazing speakers and a couple of great keynotes, which we'll talk about as we move through the presentation. Not to be outdone, DEFCON went to an almost full in-person mode as well this year. They went through their entire conference with a couple of changes from the years prior, a couple of additional safety precautions, and some other kind of quality of life improvements that they put forward for their attendees, which we'll get into here in just a second. But as I mentioned before, or actually here, let's talk about this really quick. If you went to DEF CON and you have one of their badges, the badge puzzle this year was a ton of fun. Solving the initial puzzle was actually pretty easy, but there were a ton of follow-ups that you were able to accomplish if you were able to go to the different events and villages throughout the event as a whole. Last year when we did this presentation, I actually gave some tips and tricks on how to solve the badge puzzle, and people got angry with me. So I'm not going to do that this year. What I will say is that if you do have a badge and you haven't finished the initial puzzle yet, or you're having difficulties with it, check the badge. There were a batch of these that went out that were not quite up to par in terms of their technological soundness, and so we had a couple with burned out transistors with buttons that weren't working. So take a look if you have issues with it. There are patches already out available for them, which is interesting to think about patching a conference badge, but just something to keep in mind. Okay, so moving forward, back to in-person events, and we'll use Black Hat as the kind of standard to go off of here. In 2021, Black Hat was capped out at 6,200 in-person attendees. Again, the majority of the attendees for the conference were coming in virtually. There was a limited amount of participation in the expo. There were a lot of games and rest areas set up to kind of fill the space, but it was really a very kind of empty feeling when we looked at it. This year was completely different. Over 20,000 in-person attendees came to the Black Hat conference, and more showed up for DEF CON. There were 88 technical trainings, 98 briefings, over 225 vendors in the expo, and there were virtual options for people that couldn't attend in person. So there was still some of that hybrid mentality built in. I have a feeling this is going to be a common element moving forward. We're likely to see more conferences moving to this kind of permanent hybrid model. But again, it's really good to see that the focus on in-person was there. I threw up a picture of us in our classroom. First time we've done our big ransomware response boot camp in person at Black Hat in a couple of years. And again, the environment when we're dealing with people face-to-face is always a different experience than talking to people over Zoom. We can't turn off cameras when we're in person in a classroom, so there is a lot more engagement at that point in time. Now, one of the interesting things that we saw between the two conferences in general was a focus on user safety and attendee security, which was nice to see. Black Hat went with a little bit of a lighter approach to things, offering up mask recommendations for their attendees and basically providing tips and tricks, hand sanitizer, and other ways that you could prevent yourself from contracting an illness or something like that while you were there. DEFCON, on the other hand, went a little bit more heavy-handed. They actually moved to a requirement for N95 masks for all attendees at all events. There was no way you could attend the conference itself if you weren't wearing appropriate levels of personal protective equipment. And while this was a bit controversial at first, it really didn't seem to dampen any of the spirit about the events in total. We saw a lot of enthusiasm from the participants, and there seemed to be a notable motivation from the attendees at both conferences this year to really make sure that this was a good event for everyone in person and that there was a lot to take home from it. And man, there was. We only have an hour to talk about it today, so obviously we can't get to everything that was there, but I've picked out some of the more impactful types of presentations, at least from my point of view, so I can give you an idea of what was happening there. We talked about the expo before, there being over 225 organizations represented at the expo, and it was notable. There was an absolute flurry of activity happening on the expo floor, and it was really cool to see that back in person. We had some great demonstrations from some very, very high-profile cybersecurity vendors out there. We got to see some great information from Qualys on integration of new automatic bill of material tracking, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. And again, there was this enthusiasm that was notable among the attendees at all of these events. Now, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Well, maybe a few rainbows, but not all sunshine. One of the things that we had to contend with while we were in while we were in Las Vegas for Black Hat and DEF CON was a monsoon season that was record-setting. This was one of the most intense monsoon seasons in the last decade in Las Vegas, and it hit squarely in the middle of the conference. My team and I were actually out on the strip on Wednesday walking to a restaurant when a giant crack of lightning went across the sky, and we ended up getting stuck in a massive downpour that was so intense they actually had to shut down the trams and transportation avenues between the hotels. So we ended up making our way into the hotels and going through the underground tunnels and getting back to where we needed to be. But it was an intense experience to go through, and the flooding while we were there was notable. Now, not everyone was dissuaded by this. I'm not sure if any of you have seen this pop up on Twitter or not, but here is a couple of screenshots of one of the DEF CON attendees, and yes, he is riding a turtle-shaped inner tube down one of the spillways behind the Link Hotel. All of this is floodwater coming through Las Vegas on one of the days that we were there. I can only imagine what is in that water, so I cannot recommend anyone else attempt this, but it really did show the level of dedication to making sure that this was a fun event, that everyone was having a great time. And the rider in this case was safe. They did not end up hurting themselves or being otherwise negatively impacted. But there was, again, this notable kind of attitude among the attendees that nothing was going to stop people from having a good time while we were there. Okay, so enough about the basics of the conferences. Let's talk about what we actually saw there. If you don't have it up already, go ahead and grab your InfoSec buzzword bingo card for 2022, and let's start filling out squares, because just about every single one of these buzzwords popped up in multiple presentations over and over again, and for good reason. A lot of these are really essential elements of these new and improved cybersecurity offerings that we're starting to see hit the market. Not a minute too soon either. We know for a fact from an incident response standpoint that the adversaries we deal with have been changing their tactics up significantly over the past few years, and security needs to change along with that. That was a big kind of underlying theme for most of the conferences this year. We're looking at the older ways of doing things, the more established cybersecurity protocols that we have in place, and basically asking the question of if we can do things better, or if we can tweak those policies and procedures a little bit to make them a little more applicable to what we see in the current landscape, where the threats are really coming from. We mentioned the keynote speakers from Black Hat, and we had a couple of great speakers to attend. We started off with Chris Krebs, who was the founding director of CISA and was the director of the organization from 2018 to 2020. Gave a presentation called Black Hat at 25, Where Do We Go From Here? And it was really a rundown on how the cybersecurity industry has changed and how a lot of our defenses have not, and why that's causing problems as we move forward, specifically when it comes to common cybersecurity problems that we run into, like ransomware and business email compromise. How are those impacted by our changes. We also had Kim Zetter, who is an outstanding investigative journalist, author of Countdown to Zero Day, Stuxnet, and the Launch of the World's First Digital Weapon, which is an outstanding book if you haven't read it. Kim gave a presentation on pre-Stuxnet and post-Stuxnet. Again, everything has changed, but nothing has changed. And you can see this theme kind of emerging about the reliance on older kinds of cybersecurity tactics in order to protect ourselves, and why those aren't really hitting the button anymore for us. All right, so first off, we have the state of cybersecurity, and this came from the Krebs talk. And Krebs came at this with three basic questions in terms of the state of cybersecurity as we see it today. Why is it so bad right now, which is a very good question. What do you mean it's going to get worse? And what are we going to do about it? And these three questions really kind of paved the way for the entire presentation that we were delivered by Krebs at this point. Now, one of the big things that Krebs was really emphasizing was our standpoint as defenders and as basically the keepers of this sensitive data that keeps getting targeted by hackers, and what we need to do to make sure that we are putting ourselves in a good position to defend. The big thing that Krebs was talking about was making security valuable and attacks costly, making it so that if an adversary does break into our network, it is not the simple walk through the park of stealing our data and then holding them for ransom. We want there to be some more realized consequences for these actions, and we're starting to see governments intervening in cybersecurity in general, being able to provide that level of consequence, particularly when it comes to law enforcement. Obviously, this is a delicate line to balance, but we do see some very nice new additions coming out from both the United States government and foreign governments, which will, at the very least, assist with information sharing, allow us to understand a little bit better what adversaries around the planet are doing and how we can formulate defensive strategies ahead of time so that we're not ending up doing these things on the fly during an incident. Krebs stated that we've kind of fetishized the advanced persistent threat, and this is something that if you've ever been through a demo for a cybersecurity piece of software is usually pretty prevalent. Manufacturers are oftentimes pointing out how they're able to defend against things like Fancy Bear. And while that's great, the other majority of cyber criminals have kind of been eating our lunch in the meantime, because we're not planning for the standardized attacks that we're really used to seeing. We're planning for these outlier nation state style attacks. Now, when we're talking about cybersecurity attacks in general and how they've been so impactful, we can't do that without talking about ransomware. And obviously, if you've seen one of my presentations before, we talk about ransomware pretty frequently. In this case, Krebs referred to ransomware as the biggest collective falling down of government and industry. And we have to kind of agree at this point that this is an epidemic. It's a big problem. And at this point, nearly 2/3 of ransomware victims, especially for the year 2021, ended up paying a ransom when the attack actually took place. This just cements the idea for cyber criminals that this is a profitable business model, that this is a way that they can really monetize their attacks, and they can come back and actually get additional ransoms from the victims they've hit in the first place. Primarily when we're talking about things like exposure extortion, which is its own individual beast within the cybersecurity planning community. Repeat attacks were also shown as a big problem. So when we're talking about cyber extortion attacks in general, about 80% of ransomware victims do end up experiencing a second attack, and about 68% of those experience that second attack within less than a month of the first detonation on their network. They usually have an increased ransom demand at this point and a much deeper understanding of the victim network, so they're able to extort at a much more efficient pace. 40% of those victims ended up paying a second ransom, 10% paid a third ransom, 1% paid a fourth ransom. You can see how this is a reoccurring issue. Really, what Krebs was talking about, though, as one of the biggest issues that he sees in cybersecurity moving forward is what we would traditionally refer to as kind of the M&M's model of defense. And a lot of organizations are kind of falling victim to this trap. We're putting up these gigantic, super secure perimeters on our network. We're making it so it's nearly impossible for anyone to get in. But we're missing the basic fundamentals of our cybersecurity planning program. Basically, we have a guard asleep at the front gate who is just letting people walk in at this point. Excuse me. And I would tend to agree. In a lot of the incident response cases that we work with, the way that attackers end up getting into a network and are able to move laterally and really prime themselves for a very successful detonation is not through the use of these very sophisticated techniques and tactics. They're in a lot of cases not using really sophisticated 0 days or anything like that. They're getting a set of credentials, a username and password. They're logging in through a compromised VPN, and then they're moving forward using tools that are already on the network. This is what we really need to be focused on in terms of our defenses at this point. These are the most costly cyber attacks that we see, and truth be told, they are reasonably simple to prevent if we take some general cybersecurity hygiene steps into account. One of the other things that we got to see pop up was new integrated government services, and we'll talk a little bit about how the government is playing a role in cybersecurity as a whole as we move through the presentation. I won't dwell on it too much, but there were some good clarifications that we got out of the presentations that we saw. One of the big things that we saw was the proposition of a 911 for cybersecurity incidents. This would be 311, and it would be a number that organizations could call if they suffered a significant cyber incident, if they needed help from law enforcement, if they needed direction on how to move forward. If they basically needed any kind of assistance with the attack, they'd be able to pick up the phone and dial CISA by just using 311. It's not live yet. I don't know if it will ever actually become a reality. There's definitely some opinions on both sides of that topic, but it is interesting to see this newfound enthusiasm from regulatory bodies and law enforcement to get a little bit more involved in these, and then to share that information on the back end so that we have a more complete view of what's happening in the cybersecurity landscape at any given moment. Moving forward, we got into Kim Zetter's presentation, and Kim Zetter was looking at a really nice set of basically problems that we're dealing with, and a lot of this comes back to the Stuxnet argument. Now, Stuxnet, if you're not familiar with it, was a piece of malware that was really designed specifically to target energy facilities, and it was used as a weapon of war. This was also one of the unfortunate instances where we see a weaponized piece of malware end up breaking the bounds of the initial nation state that it's supposed to target and hitting the world as a whole. We saw this with WannaCry, we saw this with NotPetya, we saw this with a few different large scale options. Now, this is not in any way a new theory. This is not something that we've seen as a more recent problem. In fact, this has been going on for decades, particularly when it comes to critical infrastructure like our power grid, and as we saw with the Colonial Pipeline attacks that took place last year, our delivery of critical infrastructure components like fuel. If one of these goes offline, if one of them is taken down for a while, there can be very serious real-world impacts that we need to be prepared to deal with. In October of 1997, and I threw this stat out there because it was something that Zetter really leaned into, the President's Commission on Critical Infrastructure said that there is an increasing vulnerability of control systems to cyber attacks. And this has been something that's been on people's minds, again, for decades at this point, but it is still a problem that we run into. Based on a few different factors, and we got to see some good illustrations of what those factors are in a couple of demos. We'll talk about one here in just a second. But when we're talking about software that needs to remain, or software and hardware that needs to remain in place and in use continuously for long periods of time, we're inevitably going to run into a couple of problems in the ability to securely maintain those systems. A great example of that came from DEFCON specifically, and this had to do with the control systems that are used on a lot of modern farming and industrial equipment. In this case, a hacker who goes by the moniker Sick Codes on Twitter was able to completely root or gain administrative privileges on a John Deere tractor control system. They were able to get enough control of this system that they were actually able to install the game Doom and play a video game on the John Deere tractor control system as it sits. Now, there are some far-reaching implications to this that are notable. One of them has to do with the what's referred to as the right to repair, and that's a concept that has come up in a lot of control systems, particularly in the industrial sector over the last few years. For John Deere specifically, they have their systems very well locked down, and the idea is if you need to do any kind of maintenance, improvements, upgrades, or repairs to your equipment, you need to have a certified technician come in from the manufacturer to perform those tasks, mainly because the owner of the equipment does not traditionally have access or the access that they need to be able to perform those duties based on how locked down the system is. It was shown that by rooting systems, we could return a little bit of that power to the individual user themselves and make for a more kind of unified landscape when it comes to the ability to control these systems. It also points out, again, the problems that we run into in these long-standing pieces of hardware and software that are required to run these systems. When we're talking about something like a combine on a farm, the expected duty cycle for that piece of equipment is in the decades, not just in the years. And so if we're running all of these things off of very highly connected computer-based systems, we need to be able to appropriately maintain the security of those systems over potential decades. And with the average lifespan of the average piece of software only being about 3 years, there is an understandable level of problem there. So overall control system problems, and these were hit in a few different presentations, often outdated hardware or software, and we've seen multiple instances of this becoming a problem for organizations in the real world. There's often limited control over software and patching and maintenance. If there's an issue with or a vulnerability discovered in the hardware and software that you're using, there may not be a fix available for it, or at least not one available quickly, because there is a very limited set of technicians who are actually certified to work on that. We have a high expectation for long service, as we mentioned before, often multiple decades of use use on the same systems. This doesn't just affect farms, though. This affects things like financial institutions, medical organizations, and a lot of others. And our reliance on third parties for long-term security. This can be a problem if we're not getting the kind of the kind of support that we need on these systems, or the company goes out of business, or software is end of life, or something like that. As a prime example of how these things can be weaponized and can be used for cybersecurity attacks outside of the industrial sector, we need to only look back to 2021. I mean, it hasn't been that long since we've seen a prime example of this happen. So in 2021, right at the beginning of the year, we started noticing a lot of organizations almost simultaneously declaring information security and data breaches. Jones Day was one of the organizations that we saw. We saw Shell Petroleum get hit with a data breach. We saw the Goodwin law firm get hit by a data breach. The city of Chicago's emails were stolen by a hack at an outside law firm. Lightfoot was hit by a massive data breach, and we were curious about what the common factor was here, because these all look to be very similar to each other. Well, as it turns out, and we've covered this a little bit before, but these were all customers of Accellion, and Accellion was a hardware and software provider that was responsible for a piece of kit called the File Transfer Appliance, or the Accellion FTA. At the point in time when the series of breaches took place, this was a 20-year-old product line, but it was still in use regularly by over 3,000 global corporations at this point. What was kind of ironic about this was Accellion was built to be a secure file transfer device. It was built to avoid data breaches and security incidents. The problem, though, was that there were a series of 0 days that were discovered by the Klopp Ransomware gang, or used by the Klopp Ransomware gang, that allowed them to take full control of these systems and exfiltrate all of the data that these systems were responsible for protecting. Now, this product has been end-of-lifed, and there is a new version of the Accellion FTA that is being made available. But at this point in time, people were still operating on these very old, very vulnerable systems. Based on how that went through, and I should point out too, the Klopp Ransomware gang did not pull this one off unscathed, because of the level of attention that was brought on them by this very particular kind of hack, because these were multi-million-dollar ransoms in each case, and in some cases public doxing of employees for the victims they were going after, which was a pretty low move on their part. They were apprehended by an international law enforcement effort, and we got to see some video of that coming through. It was really kind of a telltale view on what these organizations look like, how they function, and how profitable this can be. Again, though, based on these types of attacks and the potential for damage when really critical information from critical sectors of the U.S. infrastructure are hit, the U.S. government decided to step in, and they passed some new legislation. This was a heavy topic of discussion for many of the discussion sessions. It came up in conversation at most of the industry events, and there were multiple presentations based around this specifically. The U.S. passed new cybersecurity legislation in June of 2022, so just this year, right before the conference took place. And there were a lot of kind of interesting pieces to pull out of that. First off, this applies to critical infrastructure as it relates to the government. Now, critical infrastructure, as it's defined by CISA, relates to a series of 16 different sections of the overall U.S. economy and infrastructure. We have things like communications, we have things like chemical manufacturing, energy facilities, government facilities, information technology services, and a lot more. The actual definitions of whether or not people fall into these categories is a little more vague, so we were looking for some clarifications on that. We got a little bit, but more what we got was clarification about what the reporting requirements were for this newly signed act of legislation. This was referred to as the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022. And it had a couple of provisions that were pretty telling. First off, if you fall into one of these critical infrastructure categories and you do suffer a significant covered incident, as they describe it, you're obligated to report that to CISA within 72 hours of the reasonable belief that the incident has occurred. So once you discover that it's happened, you've got 3 days to report it out. CISA also has a requirement for critical infrastructure to report ransom payments within 24 hours. So we'll see if this is something that remains in play, or if there are changes to these timelines as we move through. There's also some new easy reporting mechanisms that can be used by organizations if they do fall into one of those categories and do need to report. You can just send off an email to report@cisa.gov, or they have a 24-hour 800 number that you can call in to report the incident to them. Now, one of the big things that we saw there was the use of the term covered incident, and we were a little confused about what exactly that meant. What is a covered incident in the terms of cybersecurity? And the Act defines a cyber incident as an incident that actually jeopardizes an information system or the information contained on such a system. This has to be a substantial impact to the CIA triad for your data. For those not familiar with the term, that's the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your data. So ransomware falls into that category in a few different ways. if this is something that will disrupt business or industrial activity, trigger a loss of service, or something along those lines that needs to be reported. And the coverage here is fairly far-reaching. Basically, we're talking about things like ransomware, distributed denial of service attacks or DDoS attacks, large-scale financial loss, compromise of information, and a lot more. Excuse me. We're going to see how this moves going forward, if there are going to be any changes or new laws that are brought into play. We anticipate there likely will be. And based on the way these laws are constructed, we also anticipate we're going to start seeing private sector organizations adopting some of these same kind of policies. Now, this won't be something that will likely be in the form of a law, but more likely in terms of a contractual agreement. So if you're bringing on a new partner or vendor, there may be provisions like this now integrated into their service contract, either stating that you need to report to them when a breach has occurred, or they need to report to you within a certain amount of time. Again, we'll see how this goes. This is a very in flux kind of topic for us, and a lot of this is new in terms of the government's intervention on a national level in terms of data privacy and security, but we'll see what happens there. Okay, so enough about government. Let's talk about what we actually saw while we were at these conferences. And one of the big things that we always like to look at are the new tools and services that are being made available. We pick out a couple of them that we thought were particularly impressive, and we will go through those here. We're going to be talking about things like open source utilities that are being made available, new community offerings, updates to common software, new software suites that are coming out, and more. So first, let's start off with email security, because email security is top of mind for a lot of organizations, especially with the move to the cloud that a lot of us have gone through over the last 2 years. If you weren't using Office 365 and were using on-premise Exchange before, odds are pretty good you've moved to O365 at this point, especially after the proxy logon and proxy shell attacks that took place earlier last year and in 2020 based on publicly available Exchange servers. One of the big things that we saw that was very impressive was the new Mimecast X1 system, and this was the demonstration they put on was very telling as to how they're adapting their software to deal with more modern threats. They're integrating a lot more artificial intelligence and machine learning components in their overall software, and they're doing this so they can detect threats in real time as they change, which is a very important thing to have access to. They're also using a new concept called social graphing, and this is basically the Mimecast system's ability to review application usage, location, activity, timing, and a bunch of other factors to identify anomalous behavior inside of email accounts in real time. And the big thing was that real-time notation. You can mark that off your bingo card now. The availability to identify that information without having to do a lot of in-depth investigation and develop custom scripting is huge, because a lot of times phishing attacks come at us very, very hard and fast, and we don't have a ton of time to actually create a defense for a specific kind of phishing tactic. If the system we're using can essentially do that for us, or to a reasonable extent can do that for us, that's going to be a much better way to go about things. They're also offering new static and dynamic content analysis for content of emails as they come into the organization. So this can be used to do things like detect impersonation, the impersonation of your upper level staff, your CEOs, your chief financial officers, things like that. We're also looking for new weaponized email attachments. We saw from the recent release of a couple of vulnerabilities within the Microsoft Office system that we don't really see attackers relying as much on the old Microsoft Word document with a macro embedded on the back end. There are a couple of vulnerabilities that came out that work off of things like rich text format documents. And in some cases, they don't even need to be fully opened for the exploit to execute. They just need to be opened in a preview window, which is different than we're used to seeing in email spam. So again, if you're interested in email security, definitely something that you should check out, or a reasonable facsimile. There are multiple other organizations that provide this same type of review of your incoming email. Proofpoint is one that comes to mind as another great option, but they're making big leaps forward in how they actually tackle these topics. Another one we saw, and we'll stick with Mimecast here for just a second because they did have some really nice offerings, is the Mimecast Mesh system. And Mesh is your Mimecast extensible security hook system, meaning you can integrate multiple outside services with a system like Mimecast. You can not just include your email, but you can also include things like your EDR and your perimeter devices and your information gathering systems and a lot more. Having these all be able to natively integrate with one single system makes them easier for your staff and your teams to work with, so there's not as many disparate sources of information to work with, and it also just streamlines operations. If we're piping things into, again, that centralized repository, it's just going to be a better situation for all of us to deal with. It's going to be much more efficient that way. Now, speaking of threat intelligence, which is again one of the things that these mesh systems can integrate, we saw a great offering come out from an organization called Title. And if you've not used Title before, or if you're not familiar with what they do, Title offers threat-informed defense platforms and threat intelligence sources that can be really helpful when we're trying to develop defenses against the more common types of attacks that are coming out. This used to be a fully paid service. You needed to have a subscription for it, and there was a fairly hefty dollar figure on the back end to make sure that this is working correctly. They're offering a community edition now, and this is going to include some of their more popular features. So their advanced search feature, a knowledge base of threat intelligence activity, tactics, techniques, and procedures for common adversary groups, technique sets, product registry, which will tell you how certain products hold up under the threat of a cyber attack, and a lot more. Highly recommend everyone going to check this out. The community edition seems to be something that is a worthwhile addition to your cybersecurity arsenal, if for nothing else than the fact that it centralizes threat intelligence. And that brings up a question that we had in a lot of cases when we're talking about where people get information about common cybersecurity attacks. Where do you get your information? Previously, we had to rely on a lot of security vendors and disparate sources. Again, we had to find this information all over the place and kind of create our own centralized repository. For things like SolarWinds, we ended up getting information from Microsoft and FireEye, customers that were directly impacted by this. We got information from CISA. We get information from security vendors, from security researchers, from other open source intelligence platforms, from threat hunting software. I mean, there's, again, an absolute litany of sources for this information, but it becomes a little bit difficult to, one, maintain a centralized repository of all this, and two, verify whether or not this information is actually valid towards what we're working for. We saw with the proxy logon and proxy shell attacks with Microsoft Exchange that after about the first couple of days of that attack cycle, an absolute ton of information, including indicators of compromise, potential tactics, potential procedures that we could look for, started hitting the forums on the internet. And as it turns out, a lot of these were incorrect. They were security researchers or security team members that at the point where they were finding this information were kind of seeing ghosts in the machine at that point. They were looking at anything that looked even the most, reasonably bit suspicious, and they were throwing that onto their list of IOCs. This ended up causing a lot of problems for us because we ended up having to chase down a lot of leads that weren't actually beneficial. So again, that centralized source for threat intelligence is a huge benefit for everyone. All right, so moving away from this, let's talk about something that's a little less known at this point, but in the future will likely be a very impactful element that most of us have to deal with. And that's the concept of a deep fake. And we'll talk about what a deep fake is here in just a second, but there was an application developed by a researcher named Manfam called Faceless. And Faceless is used to detect a deep fake or an altered video and audio stream in real time. This can be used to identify pre-recorded video that's been sent to you, and it can also identify streamed video, so things that are in like Zoom or GoToWebinar meetings that have been digitally altered to misrepresent the content. And this is again something that we see as moving forward a significant problem. There are some more humorous examples of this that we've all seen recently, which we'll talk about here in just a second, but there are also some fairly nefarious uses for this. The big thing that we saw about this, though, was its ability to detect these deepfakes in real time, and that's something that we can't really do at this point. There wasn't really a complementary tool that anyone else had put out that would be able to tell you whether or not the person you were talking to was actually the person you were talking to on a meeting. And AI technology has evolved to the point and is available to the point where real-time alteration of video is a serious problem. Now, we've mentioned the term deepfake a couple of times, so let's talk about what that is for those that might not be familiar with it. A deepfake, in its essence, is basically an altered video, and we've seen some, again, more humorous examples of this. I threw up a couple of screenshots of ones that we found, particularly entertaining. We have the movie Pretty Woman, but Willem Dafoe has been superimposed as Julia Roberts, and the dialogue matches up, and everything seems like it's right where it's supposed to be. It doesn't actually look that off, other than the fact that we know it's not supposed to be Willem Dafoe in that scene. The other one I threw up there is Wednesday Addams with Ron Swanson from Parks and Rec's face as one of the elements. And again, these are funny examples. These are things that are not very impactful, and there's a reason we put them in there is because they're humorous. But there are serious implications if this gets used for malicious purposes. Think about government officials and delivering updates to the populace that they're not actually making. Think about executives being impersonated and issuing orders to an organization that are taken seriously but are not actually coming from the executive themselves. On a darker note, think about a hostage crisis and the way that we could pretend that we've kidnapped someone if we're able to represent them as being in our control on video without them actually being there. Again, that is a pretty dark example, but it's one of the things that we have to think about. All right, moving forward from that, because it gets a little depressing when we get too into the weeds on it. Let's talk about some updates to common security protocols available in current operating systems. One of the big ones that we saw was Microsoft's ELAM, or Early Launch Anti-Malware System. And there were a couple of research projects that were built specifically on compromising this specific system and being able to take advantage of how it interacts with the Windows operating system. Now, if you're not familiar with the ELAM system, ELAM is basically a boot order priority system that allows for your security software to load very, very early in your operating system boot process. This means that your drivers that are being loaded for your external applications or external services are able to be scrutinized as they come online by your security software. This applies to Windows 8 forward, so if you're still using any Windows 7 systems, which I hope you're not at this point, but if you are, this system doesn't work. But again, this is meant to load anti-malware early enough in the boot process that other bad things can't load. Now there are specific drivers that need to be assigned to products to be able to do this. Microsoft keeps a pretty tight leash on those, but it was not perfect, as we saw from one of the big research projects that we went through. This is from Matt Graber from Red Canary. Matt Graber looked at this system and decided to go out and look and see if there were any flaws in the armor, if there were any certificates that could be abused to load malicious software prior to antivirus software in this boot cycle. And as it turns out, yes, there were several of them. There were 5 certificates from 4 security vendors that were either put together in a loose enough fashion or were misconfigured in general that were then able to be used to essentially impersonate that software and load your malware early in the boot process. Cross-referencing with VirusTotal, there were already hundreds of notations of ELAM style malware that was supposed to boot before antivirus, and this can actually take Microsoft Defender and your other antivirus systems offline if it loads early enough in the process. Matt pointed out your own malware is protected, but you can kill other process. That we effectively killed the Microsoft Defender engine in the demo, and it was a kind of eye-opening way to look at these things. One of the other things that we saw was a little different in terms of how attackers can actually go after services and devices, and this was the concept of the invisible finger. And I know, haha, we all thought it was a funny name and we all giggled about it, but the concept that this research group put out was unique, and it was something that we hadn't really thought about before. Really, it was the concept of being able to take control of a touchscreen device without actually having physical access to that device. How would that be possible? How would you be able to go through and interact with something using a remote type of technology, or at least a hands-off type of technology? The research project they put together was amazing. This was a really cool one to see. Also very terrifying. So let's not forget about that fact of it. But what they were able to do was attack touchscreen devices with what's referred to as an IMEI signal generator. And IMEI is an acronym that stands for Intentional Electromagnetic Interference. Really what this means is we're creating an electromagnetic field somewhere near a device or on a device that will trick the device into thinking that we are interacting with it the same way we would normally be. So we were touching the screen or something like that. Effective distance for this is about 3 centimeters. And the example they put forward was embedding this in like a tabletop in a meeting room or a restaurant or some kind of public setting like that, where someone's putting their phone or device down on the tabletop would put them within range of that IMEI emitter. This can simulate multiple common gestures. We got to see a great example of this. So we can do short press, we can do long press, and we can do swipes. Using those 3 types of gestures, we can basically interact with a phone or device in the same way that a user would be accessing it, just based on their normal usage patterns. And this is effective on any device with a capacitive touchscreen. And spoiler on that one, capacitive touchscreens are the kind of way to go for touchscreens on most devices, including almost all cell phones and tablets. So a large group of targets could be affected by this. So how does this attack actually work? Well, this attack is what's referred to as the charge transfer sensor, or the QT sensor. It's an element in your phone that detects when your finger touches the screen. Using noise generated by an IMEI device, we could, with a targeted application of this interference, we could basically represent it as a touch on the screen. And I threw the graphs on the bottom so we could talk about it. The one on the left is an actual finger touch. You can see we get a nice square wave pattern off of that. Really easy from a programmatic standpoint to identify when a touch is happening, when it's not, and how long the duration of that touch is. If we are using IMEI, we can see it's not quite as clean of a signal, but it does still pass that threshold. So using the signal does allow us to accurately represent a touch on the screen. So how would this actually work? How would you actually become compromised by an attack like this? Because it does seem, when you think about it just in general, a little far-fetched that something bad may happen based on this. But let's think about it this way. This is the attack scenario that they put forward. You place your device down on a table inside of a meeting room or a conference center or something like that. If your device unlocks with a PIN code or a pattern, you are vulnerable to this kind of attack. If you're using biometrics, you're not as much. So something to keep in mind as you're doing your own personal security setups. after going through your meeting or eating your lunch or something like that, you pick your phone back up and you notice that your device is unlocked. A new application has been installed, and you see an SMS message from your device, purportedly from you, off to one of your financial organizations verifying a transaction that just took place. When we think about how financially based business email compromise cases go, this is a very plausible scenario. In fact, this matches a lot of the steps that we normally see in these kind of attacks. And if the only verification we have to authorize a transaction from our financial institutions and financial partners is a text message with either an MFA code or just a simple press 1 for yes, press 2 for no kind of verification, well, we can see how this could be a problem. Again, a little bit out there in terms of a practical application, but it is a prototype of what could be a fairly simplistic way to compromise a device without having the device in your hand. So again, something we'll be watching for in the future to see if this kind of research is expanded in any way or if these attack scenarios are improved. All right, let's move away from cell phones and let's talk about some of the other big things that we noticed. There was a notable emphasis on phishing prevention at a lot of the presentations this year and in a lot of the demos this year. And again, that's understandable. When we talk about phishing, we are really talking about one of the most financially devastating kinds of attack that an organization can go through, particularly when we talk about financially based business email compromise or wire fraud or CEO fraud or the other elements of business email compromise that are fairly common. We got to see a good campaign overview released right before the conference, and this was good in visualizing how some of these new attacks are taking place and why, even with multi-factor authentication in place, if we're not utilizing good cybersecurity hygiene practices, we can still end up becoming the victim of a business email compromise. In this case, where Microsoft was talking about a phishing attack that ended up bypassing MFA in about 10,000 organizations around the country, and this strategy is used by a lot of different cyber criminal actors out there. What they're basically doing is creating what's called an adversary in the middle attack. And this means they are going to send you a phishing email, get you to go to a lookalike page that has redirects built into it. Once that phishing email is in place and we get them out to the lookalike page basically acts as a proxy between the user and the system that they're actually trying to access, which means all the information that's being passed back and forth tends to look legitimate, including things like MFA code prompts. Once the MFA code is entered, the adversary, because of their access at this point, is able to hijack a session cookie and now impersonate that user, break into their email account using the session cookie instead of their credentials, and is able to go about their business as normal. Again, this is a more complex version of what we would see as a standard credential phishing attack, but it's really not that difficult to set up this kind of an attack. And there are kits available on darknet marketplaces for just a few pennies on the dollar that will allow you to set this up in your own system. So it is definitely something we see as a more prominent issue moving forward. We will likely see this as a big issue. But what if we're not talking about something that's as sophisticated as an adversary in the middle attack or a session cookie hijacking or something else like that? What if we're just talking about a break-in using multi-factor authentication that is super insecure? Well, we got to see a great demonstration of that. This was from a research team that was utilizing an attack that they're calling a smishmash attack, which is a combination of standard phishing terms that we like to see. But this is basically utilizing the native insecurities in text messaging, so in SMS messaging, as a vector to intercept and basically compromise multi-factor authentication systems. This was big. Now, if you've ever heard any of our presentations before, you will know that we have talked about removing SMS or text message-based or phone-based authentication from your MFA systems as a high priority, and there's a good reason for that. SMS has been a target for quite a while at this point. It was it's an older type of transmission protocol, and it's really not good for sending back and forth when we're talking about highly protected pieces of information. We'll talk about why that is here in just a second. But Thomas Olofsson, one of the researchers from this project, stated it better than I really could. SMS for two-factor authentication is broken, and this is not news. It's been broken since its inception. It was never intended for this use, and we've been spoofing text messages for as long as we've been hacking. We're just now kind of starting to see it weaponized, and that is a good way to kind of view this topic. SMS, we know, is insecure. In fact, we've seen articles on this going back, close to a decade at this point now. SMS is something that we use as a fallback option if nothing else is available, but it is really not secure. I like the Krebs on Security article. Can we stop pretending that SMS is secure now? Because it's really not. And this is again one of those changes to the industry that we're seeing as necessary, something that you probably should be planning on if you're still utilizing SMS for text messaging. But unfortunately, it's not that easy. We can't just say we're not going to use it, because a lot of the systems that we work with have this built in as their only or primary form of multi-factor authentication. We're not likely to see that change without some significant push from you, the consumer. So something to watch out for. Now, why is SMS so bad? Why is this such a big problem? Well, again, this is an old technology. SMS, or simple messaging service, as a transmission protocol, was actually created back in the 1980s. So we're looking at almost 40 years of use at this point. This is a long time for something to be in business, just like we talked about with our industrial control and our tractor control systems. This was never built for secure transmission, mainly because it needs to travel in between different cell networks that aren't necessarily transmitting data in the same fashion. And this was never intended for multi-factor authentication. One of the big things that makes this such an insecure protocol is the use of something that we like to call SS7. It stands for Signal System 7. And Signal System 7 was adopted as a standard in 1988 and was revised in 1993, and is still the current standard for transmission between disparate cell phone networks. So if you're moving in between providers or in between network owners, this SS7 protocol is used to basically translate the information back and forth so it can be sent among those individual organizations. Thieves have been using this for years. We have an article here. This one's from 2017, and it is thieves using an SS7 intercept to intercept bank codes and drain bank accounts. This happened in Europe at the time, but it's not uncommon. It's something that we see as a really big issue. So again, we'll throw this out there as one of the big takeaways from the presentation. If you're still using SMS-based two-factor authentication and you have the availability of something better, use the something better and get rid of two-factor through text message if you can. If you can't, anything's really better than nothing. So I guess keep it in place, but we really want to be moving towards those more secure systems. All right, key findings from this presentation were pretty interesting. Based on the public information they were able to pull down, and this included publicly released data breaches and databases and the associating information between them, they were actually able to tie a phone number and an email together in about 20% of the listings in these public breaches. And when we're talking about the number of listings here, we're talking about billions of individual combinations of usernames, of passwords, of email addresses, and a lot more. So 1 in 5 is a significant number of targets. That is a big number that we're talking about. Carriers, on the other hand, cell phone carriers, require little or no verification from senders to actually send or spoof a text message. And this is something that we have all experienced at one point or another. Some of us who do Christmas celebrations or things like that can sign up for services where Santa Claus will text our children or something like that. From a business standpoint, we use cell phone and SMS spoofing as part of our social engineering engagements. Again, it is a trivial tactic to execute. There are automated systems that can do it for you. And there are even things like SMS enablement services, which are often used by social media influencers or celebrities to basically spoof those messages for them on their behalf. They're reasonably cheap. They're pretty easy to get into. And again, there's very little in terms of controls there. One of the other big things that was pointed out that I hadn't really thought about, and I don't think a lot of people had either, was the difficulty in identifying a spoofed website when you're using a mobile device. We know how to identify spoofed websites in a normal web browser. We do things like look at the URL, look at the redirects in the page, look at whether or not it's using secure transmission, and those can be very useful for us. On a phone or on a tablet, though, we don't oftentimes have that information directly in front of us. We have to kind of go searching for it if we really want to check. So that means if a website looks enough like its intended target website, it can really fly under the radar a lot more easily because that information is not so readily available. Also, mobile devices, as were pointed out, will autofill SMS two-factor authentication codes in a lot of cases, and that can be leveraged to hijack those codes. So a few different things there. All right, moving away from phones, let's talk about internet. One of the other big things that we saw was a researcher who was able to basically hack Starlink. And we'll talk about why this is such an interesting development here in just a second. But the researcher was able to, for about $25 worth of parts, completely root a Starlink satellite, gain complete full access to the operating system of the satellite, and begin exploring portions of the Starlink configuration and the network itself that are not really meant to be available to an individual user or to a security researcher. These are things that we would hope would be really, really tied down. Otherwise, we end up with the possibility of flaws in the system being identified, exploits being developed for this that would allow for breaking of secure encrypted transmissions, sensitive information being passed back and forth, and a lot more. And again, $25 was all the researchers spent on the parts to do this, and they were able to break right into the back of the satellite system. Now, this was built using a Raspberry Pi. And what they did was basically open up the satellite and install the Raspberry Pi as an additional component board. This allowed them to attack the bootloader of the device, and they were able to run a fault injection attack during the startup of the system that allowed them to default themselves to root access. And once they have that root access, once this exploit has been carried out, this becomes an unfixable compromise. There is no way to get around this being a problem on the satellite moving forward unless you completely replace the hardware, which again, for a lot of people is not a really feasible solution. Because of this, SpaceX came out the week after and went ahead and introduced a bug bounty program. $25,000 if you're able to point out a vulnerability in the hardware of Starlink, $10,000 if you find flaws in the network or the software that's being associated with it. So if you're looking at a new bug bounty program to go after, new target right here. SpaceX is actively looking for people to come and help. All right, moving forward, we talked a little bit about this early in the presentation, but there was a notable influence here on the SBOM, or the software bill of materials. A lot of different vendors and presenters were talking about this as a way to further secure your infrastructure. This is obviously a big topic of note because of the Log4j vulnerability, and if you didn't have to deal with Log4j in your own network, you were lucky at this point. This was a far-reaching vulnerability that impacted millions of organizations around the world, all because one individual piece of software that was a component being used for other large-scale software distributions became vulnerable. One of the big problems that we saw from this was vendors not understanding exactly what was in their software or not providing accurate notations of that to their clients. So there were quite a few victims of Log4j who ended up being victimized without knowing they were actually vulnerable in the first place. That software bill of materials will be huge, and there are a couple of big options out there. I think Qualys comes to mind as the one that we saw with the best demonstration, but automatically integrating any new software you have into an automated system. So there is a problem with a component of your software, they can automatically notify you that that problem is in place. It also underscores the importance of including key suppliers in your response planning, and this is really big. We want to make sure that when we are working with outside software vendors, that they understand what the implications of a breach of their software might look like, and that they're able to notify us in a timely manner if something does go wrong, and if we need to take steps to do that. So we don't want to know things like, will the supplier notify you if they suffer a data breach? If so, when do they let you know? What kind of evidence exists? Do logs exist to help you determine if you were impacted by this? Who covers the cost of the investigation? Does insurance cover this, and a lot more. Again, won't dwell on this for too much longer, but wanted to point out that this was a big thing that we ended up hearing a lot about while we were on the ground in Vegas. All right, so I figured I'd throw this in here as one of our last things. There's a couple more that I want to go through, and then we'll end out the session. We got to see in a rare occurrence the U.S. government actually unmask a member of the Conti organization, and this is an individual who's simply known as Target. He was unmasked through part of the Rewards for Justice program that's being offered by the United States federal government at this point. There's a $10 million reward that's being offered for information on Conti and its associates. And this is big. This is the U.S. government basically offering to pay either local or foreign researchers to unmask these people. They'll also pay you in cryptocurrency if that's something you'd like to. We can anonymize the payment. And they've also created a Tor-based reporting portal, so you can report these things anonymously over the dark web by going to their Onion site and inputting information there, which was kind of neat. This is another thing they put out on Twitter. So this was a direct reference to the individual in the picture. They said, imagine how many cool hats this guy could buy with $10 million if he were to go ahead and report some information. Well, I have no interest in hats. I do have an interest in seeing these groups taken offline, so I think this is a great step forward. Now, Rewards for Justice in general was noted on in a couple of different presentations when we were talking about government intervention, and I think this is a good scenario for them. The Rewards for Justice program is part of the Foreign Malicious Cyber Activity program, and this goes against any actors that are going against critical infrastructure or critical elements of the U.S. government. If you find information about them, or if you know information about them and you report it, you're eligible for, again, up to $10 million in reward for that. Something to watch out for. Okay, so coming up on the last piece of this, let's talk for just a quick second about the threats to job seekers in the environment. I'm sure this is something that all of us have had to deal with in one form or another, but we're seeing a lot of turnover in industries around the world at this point, and a lot of this has to do with the shift to remote work and the opportunities that has afforded people to change positions and change jobs without having to change their location and incur moving costs and things like that. Job seekers are being actively targeted by hackers. I mean, a lot of times these are nation-state hackers that are going after them. They're using things like phishing links. They're using fake organizations, social media integration. They're using their newfound trust with these individuals to deploy malware, to steal data, and a lot more. A lot of this, again, has to do with the Great Resignation and the fact that we have so many people on the market right now looking for new jobs. Again, this is not something that's necessarily new. This has been happening for a little while. In February of last year, we found out that North Korea specifically was targeting cybersecurity job searchers and researchers in a hacking campaign. They were sending out what they were referring to as evidence and new tools that could be used to test out new cybersecurity tactics. In reality, it was actually information stealing malware. So that was a problem for a lot of people. The other thing we're seeing are fake organizations, and this is one we've seen, again, moving back a little ways, but it's getting a little more prevalent. There are ransomware gangs that are masquerading as tech companies in order to recruit high-level talent. In a lot of cases, the individuals that are applying with this organization don't know that they're applying to work for a ransomware group. They'll think they're going to work for a security testing company or another cybersecurity vendor or something like that. And it is, again, trying to recruit top-tier talent without having to rely on underground forums and the potential for law enforcement to basically infiltrate those areas of recruitment and identify who is working for whom. The Great Resignation, as we mentioned before, is something that we will all probably have to continue to deal with, and this is going to make these problems worse for us as we move forward. Right now, we're showing no signs of slowing down. About 40% of U.S. workers are considering quitting their jobs and moving on to greener pastures or to other organizations or other careers in general. So it's something that we will definitely see more of in the future. So how do you avoid fake listings, and how do you keep yourself from, if you are looking for a new job, becoming a victim of a cyber attack? Well, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, we want to verify through external sources whether or not the company we're applying for actually exists. And actually, if we're applying to the right company, be aware of lookalike websites. We also want to submit information through secure channels only if it's at all possible. We don't want to be sending things back and forth through email to anonymous accounts. We want to be making sure to use branded, approved company portals to do this that are sending information in a safe and secure way. Also, be aware of lookalike job sites. We've already identified a few that are meant to look like Indeed that are not actually Indeed. So we have Indeed-jobs.club, Indeed.jobs, variations of the sites that, to someone who is not necessarily savvy on spotting those sites, may fall for, and they do look just like the regular sites. And remember, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. So keep that in mind as you're looking at new job offers, if that is something that is interesting to you. All right, so big takeaways that we got from Black Hat and DEFCON this year were pretty notable. First off, regulations are changing quickly, so all of us, from both the defensive and the offensive standpoint in cybersecurity, need to be aware of those and need to be ready to work as those new changes to regulation come. Cyber attacks will increase in frequency and intensity. This is basically guaranteed to happen. So we need to be able to better defend ourselves, and a lot of that comes from the availability of more open source information, and more resources are being made freely available. When we move back into it, beware of SMS-based multi-factor authentication. If you can get rid of it in your organization as a whole, awesome. If you need to use it, just keep a very close eye on it, and make sure your users are empowered to actually spot these fake attempts to access accounts as they come in. Zero trust is a big goal. That is something that a lot of organizations are trying to move to, although that is more difficult without the proper base level infrastructure. And finally, the human element is a top priority. We need to make sure that the users behind our systems are being empowered and are being trained appropriately to spot these kind of attacks and problems before they really become an issue. Okay, that's all I have. We'll open up the last couple minutes for questions. So thank you so much for sitting through that. Again, my name is Matt Durhan with LMG Security. If you'd like to talk to us, I'd love to hear from you. You can hit me up at info@lmgsecurity.com. Tweet me, find me on LinkedIn, and yeah, we'll open it up for questions. Natalie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Matt. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to chat them to us or submit them using the questions tab. We'll start with these ones. You mentioned zero trust a few times. How is zero trust being used for better security?
Good question. So when we're talking about zero trust as a whole, basically what we're talking about is the concept of continuous verification, being able to look at information and activity in real time inside your network, and to be able to determine at that exact moment whether or not the activity you're seeing is valid or invalid. Zero trust, as it sits, is being leveraged to kind of bring that more to the forefront and to make that more of a common element of overall cybersecurity programs. Now, again, it's not the easiest thing in the world to implement, and in a lot of cases, you need to look at how your organization is configured from a very base level to see if this is an appropriate solution. But we recommend that anyone who is looking at expanding their network capabilities or improving their security posture, look to see if there are zero trust elements that are supported by your software offerings. CrowdStrike has some really nice offerings. Carbon Black has a couple. There's some really nice ones out there. So it's not as hard as some people might think it is, but it will require some effort.
Great, thank you. Next question, what do you think the most important investment in your cybersecurity program is?
I tend to think that the investment in your staff and in the human elements of your cybersecurity program tend to be some of the most important, and mainly that's because the people that work for your organization are your first line of defense, and they are inevitably going to be the most targeted elements of your organization through things like phishing and other kind of low-hanging fruit when it comes to attack surface attempts against you and your team. Now, I don't want to make this seem like I am trying to point them out as being a security risk. That's not really how we'd like to have that inferred. What we're saying is basically that the training that you put forward to empower and educate your team is a huge benefit when it comes to the bang for your buck that you get out of those kind of training. So look at your employees, look at your frontline members first, and make sure that they know what to look for when it comes to remaining safe online.
Wonderful, thank you. And the final question, you went over this a little bit, but could you please explain a little more why so many tech people are leaving their jobs right now?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the Great Resignation as kind of a general topic, that's not relegated specifically to cybersecurity. There are a lot of different industries that are kind of feeling the hit from that. But really, what we're seeing is a wealth of new opportunities for employees based on the fact that a lot of jobs have gone to a remote work type of system. This allows them to move to that dream position or that new company, or grab a salary increase or something like that, without having to uproot themselves and move to a completely new city and all the kind of minutia that goes along with that. Because of that and all these new improved opportunities, we're seeing that big shift in the industry. A lot of people are looking for that new kind of exciting adventure, and no one can blame them for doing that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with trying to better yourself, improve your statute in your company, or move to a company you feel is better suited for your skill set. But at the same time, it has caused some issues just in general with us being able to maintain employment for a long time and be able to really really rely on individuals as kind of those base elements of our organization. Again, we'll see this continue for a while, and I'm sure it's not going to taper off. But it's something that we need to keep in mind as we're bringing on both new employees and when we're looking at keeping our own teams happy and employed with us in the first place.
Great, thank you, Matt. Once again, my name is Natalie Bray with LMG Security. We would like to thank everyone who attended today's session. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, everyone. Again, my name is Matt Durhan, Director of Training and Incident Response for LMG Security. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out at any time. We would love to hear from you. You can reach me at info@lmgsecurity.com. You can find us on LinkedIn, and you can follow us on Twitter. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.